Now, Frank Mir, I've always thought that Frank was one of the more well-rounded fighters, not just in the heavyweight division, and specifically the heavyweights. A lot of guys are sluggers. Some of them are going to be wrestlers, but ultimately a lot of the fights just turn into slugfest for the most part. But I've always really respected Frank's different dimensions of his game, and you've talked about it. He's a hell of a lot harder now to take down than he was a couple of years ago. We've seen the conditioning. He got bigger. His stand-up game, he can hurt people. The submission skills were already there. When talking to Frank Mir as well over the years, I always thought he's a great television analyst. Is he one of the smarter fighters that you've been around in understanding the complete aspect of the sport?
Oh, he's incredibly intelligent. I mean, he's so intelligent that he's the kind of guy that they'll sit on the side of the mat and do philosophy with you right afterwards and talk about the latest thing he read about Nietzsche and the Book of the Five Rings. I mean, that man is extremely intelligent. The big thing about Frank Mir is that he will always take the harder fight. So a lot of people were down on Frank Mir for quite a while, because he was on a slippery slope and had put together some losses. But when you look at the quality of fighter that he's actually fighting, he's not dropping down and fighting the guy who's 17th just so he can get a name and come back up and get another fight. I mean, Frank Mir was fighting anybody in the top 5 consistently, back to back to back to back. And I think that is one of the big things that propelled Frank to the next level. On top of that, Frank, like we were just discussing, looking at Dos Anjos, he is willing to spend the times in the areas that he needs to in order to get to the next level. So his boxing, he needed to work on it. His striking, he needed to work on it. His groundwork, phenomenal, but that doesn't mean he takes a rest from it and then comes back to it later like you see with some of the other athletes. He's working on his groundwork consistently, on his jiu-jitsu consistently. But then on top of that, he started working on his wrestling after he found that he was having a harder time with his wrestling. Then he's starting to maximize his wrestling. Then he's like, that's it. I got to be the best striker in the UFC. So that speaks to Frank Mir's character as a fighter. He's never satisfied with a victory, or he's never satisfied with a loss. Any which way that it goes, he's not going to give up, and he's always going to push to that next level.
How difficult was it during the losing stretch for you and for him? Because I know you talk about it all the time, Matt. Confidence is the key, and winning and losing can be contagious as well. How did Frank handle it? How did you handle it? Did you know that there was a light at the end of the tunnel, or was the tunnel pretty dark on some mornings?
Anytime you're on a losing, you're running in through these losses back to back. I mean, it is painful, especially because I train other fighters like Travis Brown. So Travis Brown knocks out Overeem. Frank Mir couldn't put it quite together against Overeem. So there we are in a situation where I have one guy who beats him, and then I got another guy who lost to him. And when you sit back as a coach, you're like, man, how is this happening? What do I have to fix as a coach? What strings do I need to pull to make my fighter more effective? How do I need to get through to him in better ways? So it really pushed me as a coach to figure things out and develop more. And I actually think that battle was good for me. A lot of other coaches, they're stuck in a situation where their fighters, maybe they're not as exciting, or they don't get as many finishes, or they don't do as exciting things. So maybe their fighter gets cut after 1 or 2 goes. As Frank Mir goes, I got to go through several big, high-profile losses to find the victory there with Frank Mir. And at the same time,
that must be tough, Ricky.
Within 6 months, beating the same opponent with another fighter.
It must be tough.
It was quite the journey.
It must be tough compartmentalizing that, in which, it's like a football coach or a wrestling coach. You've got to deal at Bishop Gorman with kids. Every kid is different, right? Some kids need to kick in the ass, tough love, soft love, etc., and different. But it must be tough as a coach, in which, you're with one guy, you're on the phone with one guy, and one guy wants to jump off a bridge, and another guy's on cloud 9. It must be kind of difficult for you. You got to switch gears a couple of times a day, I would imagine.
Oh, 100%. You go from one guy who's broken, and it's your job to pick him up now, and then you got another guy over here who's on top of the world, and he's celebrating like he just won the NFL ring. So you're going from one spot to the next, and it can be quite the emotional roller coaster ride. But for me in those situations, Cael Sanderson, my coach at Iowa State University, who was arguably the greatest wrestler of all time, period, and no question the best folk style wrestler of all time. He told me years ago, as a coach, the number one rule is don't get too excited about your wins and don't get too upset about your losses. Otherwise, you'll find yourself in a brutal roller coaster. And I try to follow that advice as much as I can, and it's proven to help me get through the tougher times and the better times.
It's unbelievable how blessed you've been, isn't it, Ricky, as far as the people that you've been around? As you've stated, there's so many different gyms and karate this and boxing gyms. The fact that you end up in the gym that you do as a youngster, and like you said, you didn't know you're getting tossed around by the Gracies, right? You didn't know, you don't know who these guys are when you're a kid. And then you mentioned Sanderson, the greatest wrestler of all time. It's amazing the people that you've been around.
Yeah, I honestly, Gabe, it's infectious, when you find like-minded people, and people are excited to be on the mat. They want to be a part of something bigger. They're always trying to push to the next level. That quote that you see all the time that says, it's empty on the extra mile. The road is never crowded on the extra mile.
Yeah,
that is true. You find yourself with only a select few gentlemen on the other side, and I was lucky that guys like Sanderson and Mark Schultz and Pedro Sauer and these types of individuals are standing there on the other side of that fence where nobody wants to go, nobody wants to get to the harder work, and you find yourself with a very elite group of individuals that are interested in only getting to the next level. And anybody out there who's interested in getting to that next level, you got to go the extra mile. You got to do the things the other people aren't willing to do, whether it's the 6 a.m. runs or picking the harder training partners when you're sore, or sacrificing people in your lives that are holding you back. You got to find whatever it takes to get to that extra mile if you really want success in this world.
It seems, and great words of advice that can be applied to anything, not just in sports. But it seems you look at Ronda Rousey and the influence that her mother had on her, that competitive drive, that extra nature in which Ronda's getting woken up in an armbar. And her mother's saying, figure out a way to get out of this. And I'm going to keep doing this every morning, just staying on her. How much of a kinship do you and Frank have? Because, your father was the same way, and Frank's father's a badass as well. So Frank, sort of grew up around that environment, always being tested by his father, not babied by his father.
Yeah, a competitive environment makes a big difference. I grew up in a household full of boys. There's no women in my family. And, my parents grew up, we were divorced, they divorced. Our family went bankrupt. We lost our home. We lived in a very, very small apartment. That kind of adversity builds champions no matter what. There's a lot of champions that have been built off of adversity, and I've been very lucky to have a supportive family to keep pushing on me and driving me through and teaching me what it means to never give up and teaching me what it takes to get to that next level. I know I'd never be where I'm at today if it wasn't for those experiences.